Hello and welcome to our second session on international trade law. In our first session, we've talked a little bit about the history, how we got to where we are, and today we'll talk a bit more about the current situation the world is facing between, on the one hand, development, which is on the agenda of the Doha Round, the current round of trade negotiations, and on the other hand, the so-called trade war launched by the Trump administration in its confrontation, its economic confrontation, but also geopolitical confrontation with China. So, without further ado, let's hop into the topic. As I said, the Doha Round, this is the current trade round. We've mentioned in our last session the previous trade rounds in Geneva, on sea, Turkey, the Kennedy Round, the Uruguay Round. Where are we today? Well, some 10 years, 20 years after the WTO has been established, we are still not there yet. What do I mean by that? We have still not established, for example, a completely tariff-free international trade regime. There are still many obstacles to trade, and in particular big obstacles for so-called developing countries. While I know that the term is problematic, in particular from a point of view of political science or other subfields, academic subfields, and also politically problematic, this is still the term that is being used in diplomacy. So as you can see, for example, in the Doha Round, as the leaders who come together in the Doha Round also agreed upon, they also use this terminology. Why is it somewhat problematic, however? Because it somehow suggests that other countries are left behind, that everyone walks the same path and they're somewhat slower or have started later. This is true to some extent, but at the same time is not supposed to mean that they're somewhat backwards. So, having said that, I may now quote the Doha Round agenda, where world leaders have agreed that they shall continue to make positive efforts designed to ensure that developing countries, and among them especially the least developed among them, so you will see in the next sessions that there are different categories of WTO members. Regular members, developing country members, and in particular the least developed countries, or as they are commonly abbreviated, LDCs. These countries, so for example, receive special treatment. For example, some favors are being granted to them by economically developed, richer states without necessarily having to grant the very same trade advantages, trade benefits to all other members. So, and the aim of the Doha Round is that they shall secure a share in the growth of world trade, commensurate with the needs of their economic development. And in this context, free trade is not an end in itself. It serves the purpose of enhancing well-being, economic growth, meaning that more people will have jobs, that the jobs will get better, working conditions will get better, more access to education, more economic growth equals more opportunities for people in the countries where this growth is hopefully going to happen. And how do we achieve that? I refer back to the Doha Round and the development agenda, enhanced market access, meaning lower obstacles for goods in particular coming from being exported by developing countries or least developed countries. So no tariffs at all or only low tariffs in particular, for example, when it comes to the agricultural sector, balanced rules, the rule of law, well-targeted, sustainably financed technical assistance. So this is also where the IMF and the World Bank come in, sending their experts, help them from a legal point of view, economists, experts, scientists in the respective fields and all that, and capacity building programs. All of these have important roles to play to achieve, once again, growth and economic, but also other development. Good. And what is on the agenda? First, the aim is that industrial countries, so the rich ones and newly industrialized countries, so all those countries who may afford to do so, those where you have the big markets, the markets you want to enter with your products, because this is where people are able to buy your goods, that they should grant to the least developed countries some tariff and quota-free market access for more or less 97 of their products. and for the least developed countries, in particular duty-free and quota-free market access. So, in other words, since they are having problems with competing on the international level in any case, with these products where they may have a, and I refer back to the first session, comparative advantage, meaning that even though they may be less efficient than industrialized countries, they may nevertheless, or they should nevertheless, still have the opportunity to say, okay, it makes even sense for a developed country, for a rich country to say, okay, why should we also produce agricultural products? Or even if we do, we should not be all by ourselves. It makes sense for us to have some parts of the produce. Remember the wording by Adam Smith and then later David Ricardo. Ricardo is the champion of the comparative advantage theory. It makes sense for rich countries to say, okay, even if other countries are less efficient, even if we would, hypothetically speaking, be the best at producing every single product, it still makes sense for us to focus on some products, those that have a lot of value on the world market, and at the same time also shift resources, at least in some sectors. So everyone, that's the theory, has a spot in international economic affairs. And to secure this spot so that the theory of comparative advantage is being put into practice, economically developed countries, the richer countries, should grant market quota-free access, tariff-free access, so low or no tariffs for most of their products. This is the aim here. In other words, because if there are high tariffs on, say, agricultural products, the comparative advantage is being thwarted. What does it mean? Agricultural products, you have a comparative advantage for, say, rice. And then, however, if you face 20% tariffs because richer countries want to protect their farmers, you still won't be able to compete even if your products are, if there are no tariffs, if there would be no tariffs, cheaper than those of, say, European or US farmers. This is, however, where some of the, or where a main part of the dispute when it comes to trade round, the current trade round, revolves around. The big question about the economic interest of significant and important sectors in the richer countries and the main exporting sectors in developing countries or the least developed among them. Good. This is all part and parcel of a bigger goal, of a bigger effort by the international community to enhance growth and well-being in the least developed and developing countries. Going back in time a bit, we have something called the UN Millennium Campaign from the year 2000, where the then 191 UN members, now we have 193 UN members, but back then 2 less, and some 22 international organizations, commonly abbreviated as IOs, set a number of goals. And which goals were these? In particular, among them, and sorry, as I can see, there are not all of them are being listed, can be seen. Eradication of extreme poverty and hunger, going back 1980s. That was high on the agenda in the 1980s, for example, and the conflict in Eritrea and Ethiopia, or then Ethiopia. These pictures of starving children, they shaped the minds of policy thinkers for a long time, and also the awareness of in the Western population. At the same time, however, they had a in the long run, a negative impact on the image of many Europeans or Westerners or US American citizens on Africa. However, eradication of extreme poverty and hunger still on the agenda of the UN Millennium Campaign. Universal primary education, promotion of gender equality and empowerment of women, reduction of child mortality, improving maternal health, combating HIV or AIDS, malaria and other diseases, ensuring environmental sustainability, and developing a global partnership for development. So these were a set of goals. And now for something positive. Finally, something positive. What do I mean by that? If you look at the numbers and the report on development, when you were saying, okay, now let's go back, what was being achieved, then you will see, okay, there is some progress was being made. And where do we find this progress? When it came to these UN Millennium Development Goals. So the extreme poverty rate in developing countries decreased substantially. So even though between 1990 and 2015 many more people, the population grew tremendously, the rate of people living in extreme poverty declined as well, from some 47% living in extreme poverty in developing countries to a mere 14%. Next, out of school children globally of primary school age dropped from some 100 million to 57 million. So kids went to school, and they went to school more. The primary school enrollment ratio in Southern Asia also increased. Another example, the global number of extreme poor, so to give you the total numbers in addition to the relative ones, dropped from almost 2 million to 2 billion, to some 836 million between 1990 and 2015. So although the population increased, the number of those in extreme poverty decreased, which is obviously enough significant. Then, primary school net enrollment rate in sub-Saharan Africa increased from some 52% to some 80%. Yet another sign of progress. Plus, some 90% of countries have more women in parliament since 1995. So again, progress here. And this is not the end of good news when it comes to development if we look in the long run perspective and on the global perspective. The global number of deaths of children under 5 dropped, although more children were being born during this period, some 100%, from 12.7 million to 6 million in 2015. Global maternal mortality ratio, i.e. the deaths per 100,000 live births, also decreased from 380 to 210. Then global antiretroviral therapy treatment also increased tremendously. Measles vaccine coverage also increased from 2000 until 2013. There is more skilled health personnel, and more skilled health personnel attends births, also leading to the lower numbers of the maternal mortality ratio. And last but not least, the number of insecticide-treated mosquito nets that was delivered in sub-Saharan Africa also increased tremendously between 2004 and 2014. And our last slide in this connection, if you look at drinking water, more people have access to piped drinking water since 1990, from 2.3 billion to some 4.2 billion. The official development assistance worldwide has also almost doubled, from 81 billion in 2000 to 135 billion in 2014. Most of the ozone-depleting substances were eliminated since 1990. This also goes back to a campaign where awareness about ozone-depleting substances was first raised, and the global internet penetration has also increased from 6% in 2000 to some 43% in 2015, meaning that more and more people now have access to information of all sorts and also can participate in the global service market that is also obviously made much easier by internet coverage. Good. And this leads us, and this is where I also have the money from, to the Millennium Development Goals report from 2015. So this was the time when diplomats from all over the world were patting each other on the back, saying, congratulations, we've achieved a lot. These numbers that I just showed you, these are on a global level, these are great numbers. This is something positive, finally, because if you read the news every day, you read about negative things. It's much more difficult, because this is how our brains work. It's much more difficult to make headlines with something positive. We are much more susceptible. Our awareness is much more easier raised by negative headlines. So, however, at the same time, while each other congratulated, shook hands, pat on the back and everything, at the same time, they agreed, world leaders agreed, despite many successes, which I just showed you, a number of them, the poorest and most vulnerable people are being left behind. So, there is a number of criteria, a number of factors, a number of important indicators where even although things have gotten better, in other words, the world has said we're still not there yet. There is still some progress to be made. The world could still improve. The global situation, the global well-being could still improve and should still improve. So, meaning gender inequality still persisting. There are still big inequalities between the poorest and richest households and between rural and urban areas. This is not only a question for developing countries, but also for developed countries. Think of not only when it comes to inequality, leading among them the US, but also gaps, different worldviews, different perspectives on politics between rural and urban areas, between the countryside and the big cities. Then a topic has become more and more important. It's been high on the agenda ever since the 1980s, and in particular the 1992 Rio Conference on Environment, where the Rio goals and the main aim of sustainable development were being passed and were being concluded by world leaders. But climate change is still high on the agenda, and even higher on the agenda, because its impact can be seen almost daily. So the environmental degradation, climate change, and their undermining impact, or the negative impact on progress and on poor people who are forced to move because of severe droughts, for example. Some countries even fearing that they would lose their territory because of rising water levels. All of this obviously has a negative impact on growth. Plus, conflicts. No longer interstate conflicts, but intra-state conflicts. What does that mean? Conflicts within a country, civil wars, so-called new wars, as Herfried Münkler and Mary Caldo have coined the term, to describe a situation where you have only a weak state, where states' armed forces are very difficult to differentiate from private armed forces or non-state armed groups, as they are technically called, terrorists, rebels, insurgents, whatever characterization you may choose. And these conflicts over resources, think of conflicts in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, Blood Diamonds. There's also a movie recommendation here, Blood Diamond, about these so-called new wars. They are no longer isolated situations. These conflicts are embedded within the global economy. They are being fought over resources. And therefore, they constitute even the biggest threat to human development. So, while the UN has been to a large extent successful in preventing direct conflict between two or more states. Remember, the United Nations was established in the wake of two world wars, in particular World War II, but at the same time, conflict scenarios, the conflicts shifted from between states to situations within a state, which, however, obviously may also spill over to other countries and destabilize entire regions. Just think of what is happening in Syria, destabilizing all of the Middle East and even having an impact on Europe and the political landscape in Europe. Plus, and this was the determination here when it came to assessing the long-term impact of trade of the Millennium Development Campaign, millions of poor people were still living in poverty and hunger without having access to basic services. And now we're at the larger picture of the Doha Round development, and we have something called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Here you find the website in case you're interested about further information on this. What matters here for our purposes are the 5 P's. People, planet, prosperity, peace, partnership. This is the global framework also relevant for the Doha Round. That people, however, at the same time, while economic progress and prosperity is important, it is not an end by itself. Free trade is not an end in itself. It's necessary for peace. It's seen as one of the preconditions for peace, in addition to democracies and institutionalization, international organizations such as the UN, but also regional international organizations. Think of the African Union or the European Union. The European Union often gets credit for having contributed to peace in Europe after the Second World War, that we have not relapsed into a situation of interstate warfare, and all of them are interconnected. And last but not least in this regard, partnership. Partnership between the developed and least developed and developing countries, and also between economic powerhouses. These are the terms being used in diplomatic language, but the cynical minds among you may obviously enough also have critical views on that and say, okay, what does that mean in practice? And we'll talk about that in a few minutes when it comes to the current situation. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, so the follow-up campaign to the UN Millennium Development Goals, sets 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and these are further subdivided into 169 targets. I'll only read out the 17 Sustainable Development Goals here. First, once again, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Second, end hunger, achieve food security, so even in situations of severe droughts or if there is a food shortage, that there are, for example, public stock holdings, and improve nutrition and the promotion of sustainable agriculture. Sustainability is a key term here. Why is sustainability key here? Because many developing countries argue that they were unable to achieve economic progress, and they are still unable to achieve economic progress, while at the same time, and they're being hamstrung, there's an obstacle because it's always necessary at the same time, well, that their economic progress nevertheless should not harm the environment. And what is the argument here? It's that they would accuse developed countries that they were able to achieve economic growth at a time when there were less strict rules on the environment about combating climate change. That was not high on the agenda. It was not on the agenda at all during the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Only in the 1970s did something akin to global awareness for environmental concerns first emerge in the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the global environment, where, for example, the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, first was established. But before that, countries could more or less do what they want with the environment, because after the Second World War, everyone was only thinking about and dedicated to achieve economic growth, to get back to a situation where countries would prosper and leave the traces of the Second World War behind. And now developing countries say they don't have the same chances, they don't face the same situation, because they, on the one hand, they want to achieve progress, economic progress. On the other hand, however, while doing so, they still have to adhere to a lot of environmental rules and to combat climate change. That's why sustainability is key here. Long-term perspectives. It also can be found was a key concept in the 1992 Rio Conference on Environment, where a set of basic principles about environmental law and the treatment of climate change, for example, were being drafted by the participating states. Goal number 3 of the Sustainable Development Goals, ensuring healthy lives and the promotion of the well-being for all at all ages. Goal number 4, ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promote the promotion of lifelong learning opportunities for all, which is also being made easier by internet penetration, by the way. Goal number 5, achieving gender equality and empowerment for all women and girls, be it on the political sphere or on the economic sphere. Goal 6, ensuring availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Because in particular in other regions, think of the Middle East again, or many sub-Saharan African countries, access to water and clean water is key. Goal number 7, ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. Again, key for economic growth. Goal number 8, the promotion of sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. Goal number 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization and foster innovation. Goal number 10, reducing inequality within and among countries, what we mentioned earlier, that even if countries on a whole may have a better economic situation, it does not mean that the situation has become better for all citizens, but it could also be the case that only for the top 10%, or that they have benefited from economic growth much more than others. Goal number 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. In this connection, think of the emergence of so-called megacities, which is obviously also a topic when it comes to diseases, pandemic diseases, epidemic diseases such as the coronavirus. If people are living close to each other, and if there are neighborhoods, so-called unofficial neighborhoods, where you don't have even ownership, where the police would usually not show up, or if so, only heavily armed, these places that are somewhat escape the control of their respective regional or federal governments, obviously enough, it is much more difficult to control these spaces in a situation of a disease, or if it's spread of disease, or also when it comes to sanitary facilities and so on and so forth. Goal number 12, ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. So the way we consume, think of our global footprint, and the way we move by moving airplanes and so on and so forth also has an impact on the environment. And the last goals, number 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and all of its impacts. So once again, sustainability plays a role here. Economic progress, yes, but not at all costs. Goal number 14, the conservation and sustainable use of the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Goal number 15, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. So, for example, think of CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, that the preservation of endangered species. Think of the global lung in Brazil, or climate and its impact on climate if there are more forests being chopped down. Goal number 16, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all. The rule of law becomes relevant here. We'll talk about that when it comes to Article 10 of the GATT. And building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. In other words, state building or nation building. On the one hand, foster a situation where people living on the same territory feel a sense of belonging to each other, of being part of the same community. On the other hand, however, having functioning, responsible institutions at all state levels and combating in this connection corruption first and foremost. And goal number 17, strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. Good. And this leads us to the situation we are facing today, the other side of the coin of the situation we're facing today. So what you see here in the global development, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, these are the utopian goals. And some describe international law, international relations as the eternal battle between utopian goals in a positive sense, obviously, making the world a better place, and those, you could say, the Grinch of international diplomacy, the Grinches of international diplomacy, those who consider themselves as realists, those who say that there are limits to what we describe as multilateralism and international cooperation in achieving these goals, and those who would say we always have to put our country first, which is understandable from the point of view of an individual state leader, but it is not necessarily mutually exclusive to the aim of achieving global prosperity. And this leads us to the situation now, as I said already, the other side of the coin. Many fear today that we have now and we are already witnessing, and we have witnessed already, a new wave of protectionism. And the United States is key here. Why is the United States key here? Because this is the lead country, still the most powerful countries from a military, most powerful country, both from a military perspective and from an economic perspective. Whereas the European Union is also a powerhouse if you take all of it together, one of the strongest economies. However, even the European Union, as can be seen, for example, during the Corona crisis, that states then refrain from cooperating and everyone looks after himself. In the US, however, this is still, while the European Union is somewhat close to a state, to having achieved statehood, in particular in an economic sense, nevertheless, at the end of the day, it's more than only highly federalized. States would still be keen on their sovereignty when it comes to protecting their respective populations. With the US, however, the US acts as a whole, not only in an economic sense, but also in a political sense, regardless now of the level of federalization within the United States. And the US has now done something under Donald Trump, it has reverted from Barack Obama, and who was more of an adherent to multilateralism and the so-called liberal world order, towards going back to something Donald Trump himself has described as principled realism. This is something where states would look after themselves, say, okay, and everyone else, and this is what also Mr. Trump has emphasized, he's perfectly fine with every other country doing the same thing. He said that it's the responsibility of each world leader to look after his or her own people first and put them first. And whereas others accuse the US of having done the same thing also during the Obama era, and obviously during the George Bush era, who however was also multilateralist, although of a different kind. And even under Bill Clinton, he's the first president to say it in such an explicit manner that he puts his country first. And this is obviously a global shift from a diplomatic point of view and an international relations point of view. At the same time, going back to economics, Mr. Trump has also endorsed first a policy where the US is also keen on protecting some of its key industrial sectors, in particular steel and aluminum, because as he said, and we'll talk about it in a later session when it comes to security, where he said that steel is steel. If you don't have steel, you don't have a country. What does he mean by that? For example, you need the steel industry to produce military goods. You don't want to be dependent on other countries and imports from other countries when it comes to vital military products, for example. Think of a tank. That's the first one, the first point in this connection. Plus, he's also keen on recalibrating the trade relationship with one country in particular, namely China. China is very high on the target list of Mr. Trump because he said, well, on the one hand, he has respect for China's President Xi Jinping. On the other hand, however, he knows that the Chinese president is as keen on protecting his sovereign interest as he himself is. So that's why he launched this so-called trade war by saying we have to battle the trade deficit with China. What does it mean? What is meant by a trade deficit? The US is importing much more from China than China is importing from the US. Hence the trade deficit. And he accuses this unhealthy trade relationship between the United States and China as being responsible for millions of jobs being lost. I will present you with a number of different views in a few minutes as well, but for the time being, we'll listen to a speech by Donald Trump in the United Nations General Assembly.
We believe that trade must be fair and reciprocal. The United States will not be taken advantage of any longer. For decades, the United States opened its economy, the largest by far on earth, with few conditions. We allowed foreign goods from all over the world to flow freely across our borders. Yet, other countries did not grant us fair and reciprocal access to their markets in return. Even worse, some countries abused their openness to dump their products, subsidize their goods, target our industries, and manipulate their currencies to gain unfair advantage over our country. As a result, our trade deficit ballooned to nearly $800 billion a year. For this reason, we are systematically renegotiating broken and bad trade deals. Last month, we announced a groundbreaking U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. And just yesterday, I stood with President Moon to announce the successful completion of the brand new U.S.-Korea trade deal. And this is just the beginning. Many nations in this hall will agree that the world trading system is in dire need of change. For example, countries were admitted to the World Trade Organization that violate every single principle on which the organization is based. While the United States and many other nations play by the rules, these countries use government-run industrial planning and state-owned enterprises to rig the system in their favor. They engage in relentless product dumping, forced technology transfer, and the theft of intellectual property. The United States lost over 3 million manufacturing jobs, nearly a quarter of all steel jobs, and 60,000 factories after China joined the WTO. And we have racked up $13 trillion in trade deficits over the last 2 decades. But those days are over. We will no longer tolerate such abuse. We will not allow our workers to be victimized, our companies to be cheated, and our wealth to be plundered and transferred. America will never apologize for protecting.
And this was a UN General Assembly speech, as I already said, by Mr. Trump. So this is the venue where leaders of the whole world come together each fall in New York in the UN General Assembly, either the heads of states, heads of governments, or at least their foreign ministers, and everyone has a speech. Everyone gets the attention of the international community to redirect attention or direct attention towards a specific topic. And Mr. Trump, while this long speech also covered aspects such as, for example, the situation or the confrontation between the US and Iran, also grabs the opportunity to accuse China of a number of international law and in particular international trade law violations. For example, unfair trade. In this connection, we also cover subsidies, but when it comes to China, what he accuses China of is in particular dumping their products, i.e. selling the products below the value, below their value, below the price at which they are being sold in China or in the domestic market. Currency manipulation. It's not only a trade law question, but also a question of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and its articles. And the IMF is responsible for the surveillance of monetary policy, coordination, and ensuring that there is no hyperinflation, for example, and also no currency manipulation. Something that China has been stood accused of already during the financial crisis 2017, 2008 onward, but back then no one had a problem with that in the US. The US only started to make or to see a problem here under the administration of Donald Trump. And last but not least, he's also accusing China of violating WTO law in the sense of violation of property rights infringements, intellectual property rights infringements. And what has he done in return? He imposed tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum, which were above the bound rate by the US. We'll come to that in our session on tariffs and market access. For the time being, what you need to know is that these were a blatant violation of WTO law by the US, justified with national security interests. What I mentioned earlier in the speech where Trump announced his tariffs on steel and aluminum, he referred to the notion that steel is steel. If you don't have steel, you don't have a country. You can't build your military. You need to be completely independent. You have to ensure that your domestic steel production is remains in place, that it does not go bankrupt, because otherwise you would be dependent on foreign countries and they would have some leeway in negotiations or could even use their leverage against you by trying to dry out your military sector, for example. However, whether this justification holds or not, currently there is a dispute at the WTO, which however will never be settled for the time being at least, because the WTO dispute settlement system is not fully working. Why not? Because the appellate body, the Supreme Court of Trade Law Matters, you could say, is not functioning because there is only one member left, the Chinese judge or quasi-judge, while the other members have not been reappointed by Mr. Trump. He has blocked the reappointment of other members, and you need the consent of the United States. And there could be some workarounds, but it doesn't make sense. If the US doesn't cooperate, the US doesn't cooperate. So this current trade dispute between China, but as you will see in a minute, not only China, will not be resolved for the time being because the dispute settlement system of the WTO is not working. So you see here an attack by Mr. Trump on the current trade system, not only by violating the rules, but also attacking the WTO as such, and the crown jewel of the WTO, the dispute settlement body, the dispute settlement system of the World Trade Organization. In addition, these tariffs by Mr. Trump have not only been imposed on Chinese products, but also on steel and aluminum products from the European Union or Canada. So how did countries react in this connection by also imposing tariffs? Well, strictly speaking, countries would be obliged to first address and take the matter to the WTO and address the matter in front of the WTO. The European Union and Canada also quickly realized it doesn't make sense because, as I just said, the WTO is not working. It is not the body responsible for authorizing sanctions or countermeasures, trade countermeasures, as a sort of coercing the US to adhere to trade law again, is no longer working. So the European Union also imposed tariffs on US products. Why did the European Union do that? As I said, didn't want to wait for an authorization by the WTO, which might never come, or at least not under President Trump. And how did the EU design these counter tariffs, these retaliatory tariffs? Not by putting tariffs on steel and aluminum, but trying to hurt industries which are close to President Trump, for example, where his electorate is located. So, for example, Levi's or whiskey or Harley-Davidsons. All products that are being produced in federal states inside of the US, where the majority of people have voted for Donald Trump. But also the legal basis, if you look at it from a formal perspective, for these retaliatory tariffs is also shaky. They stand on shaky ground. Why? Because strictly speaking, also the European Union would need to wait for an authorization by the World Trade Organization. But the World Trade Organization, as I said, is not working sufficiently these days. Good. What I also should mention here briefly is Brexit. Brexit is also another side aspect that led to the disintegration of the economic system, the disintegration of the European Union as a customs union. The British have decided to pull out of the European Union, to withdraw from the European Union. Therefore, the European Union loses some of its economic power. The US is now trying to conclude and have already flirted with the idea of concluding a free trade agreement with the British and pull them closer to their economic side. Some have jokingly said the British are now finally going to become the 51st state of the United States. But for the time being, however, it remains to be seen whether there will be an equal partnership. Because as many members of the Trump administration openly acknowledge, and he acknowledges himself, he wants to negotiate on a bilateral level. Why? Because in a bilateral sense, the US are always the more powerful trade negotiator, the more powerful side to trade negotiations, and that's why they would prefer bilateral negotiations instead of having to negotiate with the whole European Union, for example, because in economic terms, the European Union and the United States are equals. So this is a further factor contributing to the disintegration of the multilateral trade system and in particular the World Trade Organization. Speaking of the World Trade Organization, you may wonder where Donald Trump has these ideas from and why the WTO is such a target. This is not only in his General Assembly speeches, it was also already during his presidential speeches while he was still a candidate. It was already also the target of many speeches in his early phase of his presidency. And as I said, he also directly attacked the WTO, for example, by blocking the reappointment of its members. He considers the WTO as being unfair towards the US because the US has lost numerous cases at the WTO. For example, when it comes to zeroing, as calculating the margin of dumping and so on and so forth. We'll come back to that in our session on unfair trade practices and dumping. And because the US has lost some cases, many feel, and this leads us back to the notion of sovereignty. Sovereignty is key for powerful countries in general and for the US in particular. And they feel that their sovereignty is being infringed or threatened by such international organizations like the World Trade Organization. The notion that some foreign judges have something to say about the trade policies of the United States. Think of the presidency of George W. Bush, who also already imposed tariffs on foreign steel by arguing that these would be safeguards. He also lost the case at the World Trade Organization because the WTO said that there was no such a situation of an economic emergency threatening the domestic steel industry. This was mere protectionism without any justification or sufficient justification. And in other words, Mr. Trump is angry at the World Trade Organization and he's also angry at China and also angry at Bill Clinton, and therefore also angry at Hillary Clinton, which he repeatedly criticized for actions done by her husband during the presidential race, during his presidential campaign back in 2016, for even allowing China to enter the World Trade Organization. So first he has a problem with the World Trade Organization as such, then he has a problem with China, and thirdly he has a problem with the accession of China to the World Trade Organization back in 2001. And he also accuses China of numerous violations of World Trade Organization rules and trade rules as such, while at the same time having a problem with these rules. And if you ever wondered where Mr. Trump has all of these ideas from, I may redirect your attention or direct your attention towards a documentary done by Mr. Navarro. Maybe you've never heard of the name Navarro, the last name Navarro. Peter Navarro is one of the key economic advisors of Mr. Trump, and he was appointed in the early phase of his presidency, and he is still around. So you may have witnessed that a number of advisors and also members of his administration have already left. Rex Tillerson is gone, for example, to name just one of them, or Nikki Haley, his UN delegate, also no longer member of the of the Trump administration. But Mr. Navarro is still there, and Mr. Navarro is one of the, you could say, champions of what could be considered the US economic fight against China. And you see him here in the bottom left. And why does he matter? He produced a documentary called Death by China. It's available on YouTube, and I'll show you a short part of this documentary to give you an idea where Donald Trump has his inspiration from and why he's attacking the World Trade Organization and simultaneously China for violating the main rules of the World Trade Organization. And however, when watching this documentary, either the part I'm going to show you in a few seconds or the documentary in full, always view it with a grain of salt, cum grano salis. Why? Because this is a very manipulative documentary. It's well made. Apparently Donald Trump watched it himself. There are numerous reports that he watched it, and then he decided to appoint Mr. Navarro as one of his key economic advisors. But let's watch a short clip from this documentary and its part about China and its relationship to the World Trade Organization.
Hi, I'm Peter Navarro, director of Death by China. For 3 years, this documentary film was one of the most popular on Netflix, and now you can watch the official version for free. So enjoy the show, and afterwards, check out my new book and film, Crouching Tiger, What China's Militarism Means for the World. And please, help defend America and protect your family. Don't buy made in China. You're going to be okay?
I'm 63 years old. I'm likely to skate my way to the grave. But I have 3 young children who are all engineers, and I worry about their ability to work in American manufacturing down the road.
I think that the water's going to get hotter and hotter, and if there's no event to wake people up, I think China can just own more and more and more and more of our debt, and everything's fine until that magical moment when it's not. And all the sorries in the world aren't going to make that any different.
The film you're about to see addresses one of the most urgent problems facing America. its increasingly destructive trade relationship with a rapidly rising China.
Yep, this is a documentary that was apparently highly influential inside of the US and was, as reports state, also watched by Donald Trump himself and led to the appointment of Peter Navarro as one of his foremost economic advisors. So against this background, and now that you've perhaps had a glimpse of the US perspective on China as an adversary, not only economically, but also from a military point of view, that perhaps helps explaining why the US is so keen on, for example, pushing China out of the World Trade Organization, or at least competing with China, not only in a peaceful economic sense, but also by using every tool it has in its economic box available. Good. But this is only one side of the coin. So as you could see here, China is being blamed for the loss of manufacturing jobs, the manufacturing base inside of the US. In addition, in the book and in the documentary, there are also accusations which are correct, for example, when it comes to human rights violations inside of China, accusation of the suppression of the Falun Gong, of the Muslim population inside of China, and all that. So it bundles together human rights abuses, economic violations, the rise of China, the question is that peaceful or not, with an accusation that China was admitted to the World Trade Organization in the first place. However, keep in mind what I also said at the first session, back in the 1990s, the situation was different. And the Bill Clinton administration also adhered to the view championed, for example, by Milton Friedman, that with economic progress also comes human progress, comes a better track record in connection with human rights, and that there would be a peaceful rise. And at the end of the day, if the US and the world turns it back to the Chinese would say, okay, they are ignoring us. Again, think of the long memory of the Chinese, the 19th century. It's also written in the Chinese constitution. You find a reference to the long 19th century and oppression by European powers, the Opium Wars. All of that is implicitly mentioned already in the preamble of the Chinese constitution, so they have not forgotten. So they now want to compete economically, take over as a leading world power, or become perhaps the next leading world power. So we're now in the last phase of the US-dominated international landscape and moving towards, you could say, the Chinese century or the next Chinese decades. Remember, world politics is always can be categorized into which country was the dominating country, the British, then the US, and perhaps next the Chinese. But the big problem is that is something called the Thucydides trap, Greek philosopher who observed that rising powers almost naturally are inclined to a confrontation with pre-existing powers. The Spartans and the ancient Greeks, for example, or today, the confrontation between the US and China. Or think of the First World War, which is explained by the Thucydides trap, that the British and the Germans as the next rising power in Europe, were also caught in this trap. The pre-existing power and the emerging ones, will they be confronted not only economically but also militarily? That is the big question we're facing from an international relations perspective. But we will now, again, in this class, in this virtual class, focus on the economic aspects of this possible confrontation. However, I will conclude today's sessions with other views, in particular those of the former WTO chief, Mr. Pascal Lamy, and then with a statement by the current WTO chief, Mr. Azevêdo. So, first, however, we'll start with the statement by Pascal Lamy, who has addressed the question as to whether the world is entering a trade war and the economic impact of such a trade war.
It's serious, but I do not think we are on the verge of a real trade war. It's more than what the US administration has done so far in terms of implementing the protectionist agenda of Mr. Trump. And yet, I don't think it's a real breakthrough. This was to be expected. By the way, it's still very unclear what are the countries who are really targeted beyond China, in Europe, in Northern America, unclear. And it's a typical old-fashioned protectionist measures. It's not the first time the US imposed some sort of trade restrictions on steel. It's on the ground of national security, which for most of us is extremely overstretched. Why not potatoes or shoes, who really matters also for soldiers? But we will see whether or not this leads to an overflow of steel that doesn't go to the US and that would go elsewhere, in which case, notably in Europe, countermeasures would be taken.
But when you get the US president threatening, promising tariffs on steel, and Jean-Claude Juncker says Europe could hit back and actually is specific. Harley-Davidson's, Bourbon, Levi's. These aren't esoteric threats. These are concrete products that are now in the firing line.
Yeah, but I mean, again, Richard, let's take this notion of a trade war with a pinch of salt. The reality is that Mr. Trump wants to protect more the US steel industry, which obviously is not very competitive, and this will lead to US consumers and other industrial sectors paying more for uncompetitive steel. At the end of the day, nobody, at least on this side of the Atlantic, believes it's a good thing for the US. It's a bad thing. It will backfire, as it did in the past. Remember, last time the US imposed a safeguard on steel, and I have some reason to remember that because I was EU Trade Commissioner at the time. They had to remove it because it impacted too much sectors like the car industry or the machinery industry.
Right. So let's get right to the bottom of this. When President Trump tweets, trade wars are good and winning this one will be easy, is that helpful?
My answer to that is no, but I don't think many people would care. Mr. Trump obviously believes that trade is a win-lose game, like a war. You win, I lose. I win, you lose. Most of the people on this planet do not believe that trade is a win-lose game. What binds people together on this planet about trade, the reason why everybody agreed that under some conditions more open trade is good, is that it's a win-win game. It's not a win-lose game. And this is where I think he departs from a world consensus and from the way the modern economy is organized around this planet with global value chains. So going back to the Middle Ages, I think will not help. But if that's his view, let him try. We don't think it will work.
So this was a contrary theory to the notion of a trade war and whether it's good or not. And we will also listen to his successor as Director General, Mr. Azevêdo, a Brazilian diplomat, and you could say the current face of the World Trade Organization, meaning that an international organization needs organs or persons who act on its behalf, just like states do. And if you think of the World Trade Organization and a voice that speaks on its behalf, think of Mr. Azevêdo, its current Director General, and he has another explanation as to why jobs are being lost in industrialized countries in general and the US in particular. Another explanation than simply the accession of China to the World Trade Organization. But listen to his interview.
Today, there is a lot of uncertainty in the air, a lot of feelings of being left behind in most advanced economies. To the unemployed, it's no consolation to say that trade is a positive for the economy. But what is important is that we get the diagnosis right. I think out of 10 jobs lost in advanced economies, around 8 are due to new technologies, higher productivity, innovation, and we all want that. We don't want those things to disappear. We have to be ready for that. We have to be ready for these changes, which are, some are calling the fourth industrial revolution. But trade is a minor participant of all that. I think trade, in fact, creates opportunities and it's a force for development and growth.
Good, and that concludes today's session. I hope I was able to give you an insight into the different perspectives on international trade and the so-called trade war, helping you understand where do these positions come from, where was the worldview, the economic worldview by Mr. Trump shaped. At the same time, keep in mind cum grano salis when watching the documentary, or only the small part I showed you here. And at the same time, you saw the different perspective on why jobs are being lost, what is currently happening, does it make sense to start such a so-called trade war? Is it even a trade war yet? What are we afraid of? Where could we end up? There was a different perspective given by the former WTO Director-General Pascal Lamy and the current one, Mr. Azevêdo from Brazil. Having said that, I hope that it was an interesting session for all of you. In the next one, we'll talk about the basic rules of the World Trade Organization, also called WTO law or trade law. You can use both of these terms since most countries, most participants in the global trade system are also WTO members, and therefore the rules of the WTO are also the rules applicable for the vast majority of international, interstate trade relationships. Having said that, I will close today's session and looking forward to see you in the next session, and have a good day.